Okay, so welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. In the previous video in the series, we were looking at Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, and more specifically, we were looking at Chapter 4 out of the book, which has to do with the theme of creativity. In that video, we noted that creativity, in contrast to many schools of mainstream psychology, occupies a pretty central part within humanistic psychology. It's definitely a recurrent motif within humanistic psychology, and that's not the way it is very often in mainstream psychology. But at any rate, Chapter 4 out of the book, which we started in the last video, basically we got through like a quarter maybe of the book in the last video. And in doing that, we were looking basically at two different themes. I think two different themes are the most important ones. The first of which is to notice that part of the reason why humanistic psychologists are so interested in creativity is that it's a marker of self-actualization, that Maslow finds that self-actualizing people are very often creative in one way or another. Not necessarily that they're artists or musicians or creative in some conventional sense, but science involves a certain kind of creativity. Politics can involve a certain kind of creativity, but at any rate, self-actualizing people tend to be also creative people. So that's the first point. And the second point had to do with this whole business of his emphasis on art education as a way of trying to cultivate creativity within the educational system. And that begins to form the contours of a humanistic psychological vision of what education would be, because from a humanistic psychological perspective, education would be much more holistic in character than we typically assume it should be, because typically we assume that as long as we are imparting pragmatic job skills and as long as we are making people cognitively more agile and seemingly smarter so that their SAT scores are higher, the mission of education has been fulfilled. But of course, Maslow's commentary on that is that's not even close to being the case, because really education in the better and deeper sense of the word would aim at helping us cultivate all of the different dimensions and latencies of our being, including creativity and including our being itself, deepening our being itself. So that basically begins to form the contours of a humanistic psychological vision of education. So those 2 points are the main ones we covered in the last class, or in the last video rather. So that sets us up for re-engaging with Chapter 4 in terms of this distinction that Maslow draws between two different phases of creativity. So because I guess the creative muse was upon him, he titled them thus: primary creativeness and secondary creativeness. And by the way, that is sarcasm for those who are not fluent in it. I studied it as a second language in college. But at any rate, primary creativeness is basically the hot inspirational phase of creativity, where like the muse is upon you, the idea is upon you, the inspiration is upon you. And then there's secondary creativeness, which means all the hard, detailed, nuts and bolts type of work it takes to develop the idea, develop the initial inspiration, and to bring it into its full fruition. It's a little bit like this old adage from Thomas Edison. He once said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Okay, so here was definitely a creative person within the domain of invention for sure. So 1% inspiration, in other words, 1% primary creativeness in Maslow's terms, and then 99% hard work, all the hard work to bring out to bring the idea, the inspirational idea into its full fruition. Okay, so primary creativeness, the hot, inspirational, sort of volcanic type phase. And what Maslow is going to do in the rest of this chapter, which is typical of Maslow, by the way, very often we'll see this again in the next video in this series, he makes a distinction between two modes, in this case of creativity, and then he spends almost all his time on the one that he thinks is closer to the top of his hierarchy of needs. So he's going to end up spending 95% of the rest of the chapter on primary creativeness and what goes into this hot, inspirational, volcanic phase of creativity. So a few descriptors right off to sort of flesh out what primary creativeness is about. there in your notes, a kind of loss of the experience of past and future. What that means is that in the hot inspirational phase, we're really dwelling in the depth of the moment itself. Like we're really fused with the demands of the present moment, and that's the mode of temporality that is the main one in this phase of creativity. So it's not so much about remembering stuff in the past or projecting things into the future. It's about inhabiting the present moment. So immersion in the moment, being in the zone. I've used that phrase in earlier videos on Maslow. A kind of tirelessness, like when we're in the hot volcanic phase of creativity, it's very easy for us to work for many hours, and hopefully you're beginning to reflect as I go into some of these descriptors that Maslow gives us about your own experiences of creativity and sort of the hot, when you're really sort of chasing that idea down and you're really making love with it in a sense, you know, and trying to bring it to its consummation, I guess, to go along with the metaphor. So kind of tirelessness, a kind of selflessness, like you're not really worrying about whether this idea is going to be acceptable to others or how you'll look or whether you'll look stupid if it fails or something like that. So your normal self-consciousness and your normal sense of self-observation falls by the wayside. Instead, there's a fusion with the reality at hand, and he identifies it as a kind of peak experience. So the hot creative moment is a little bit like other kinds of peak experiences that we've been talking about, like deeply spiritual or numinous type moments, or moments of epiphany, or deep revelation, or union with the universe and things like that. Well, creativity and being in that hot volcanic moment itself can be a kind of peak experience. So those are some initial descriptors. We're going to give you a lot more in this video today, but that'll give you sort of the lay of the land. Then secondary creativeness, so that's the perspiration part. If you follow that little adage from Thomas Edison, that's the perspiration part. That's the hard work and the development of the inspiration. So, like I said, what he's going to be doing in this chapter is spending almost all of the rest of the chapter on primary creativeness. So, and he does this once again in terms of a list of descriptors of aspects of creative inspiration. In other words, primary creativeness. So when he researches people who've had creative inspirational moments and who are known for being creative people and asks them what it's like, here are a bunch of descriptors. And the list is kind of long, and it's going to carry us through the rest of this video, as a matter of fact, as I sort of look through it. So we'll try to go through these not too slowly, but to try to give you an idea. Once again, the way to understand this is to let each one of these descriptors be a kind of brush stroke across the canvas that is painting a picture for you of what primary creativeness looks like. So the bad way of studying this is to try to memorize all these descriptors. The good way of studying it is let them form a picture or a gestalt of what primary creativeness really looks like. And once again, as we go through these, I'd like you to maybe in the back of your mind wonder about and reflect upon your own moments of creativity and what was really going on there when you were in the heat of creative inspiration. So, another thing before we get into this list would be a lot of these descriptors kind of group together too. So like I'm looking at the first couple of them, and they sort of group together, and there are other groups as we go through them. So let's say the first two, let's look at the first two. Number one, giving up the past, the tried and true, business as usual. So to be in the heat of the creative moment doesn't mean that you're going to be simply propelled and preordained by the habits that you've had in the past or stuff that other people have done in the past. It's about giving up what has happened in the past in favor of the uniqueness of the present moment. Similarly, with respect to the future, so giving up the future, the project of being mostly for some end, like trying to get something done, you know, primary creativeness has a kind of timelessness about it. Or another way of saying it is you're really in the present, okay? So being in the moment, inhabiting the moment, being fused with the demands of the moment are elements of this primary creativeness thing. Okay, so the first two I think obviously go together, and they have to do with time. Okay, so the next few also clump together in their own way. So number three he describes it in terms of an innocence, like a kind of childlike wonder. So to be in the primary creativeness phase is to be almost in a childlike state. And maybe if you reflect back to your own fascination with being creative when you were young, perhaps before you were told whether you were good at it or not, or anything like that, before you had superimposed upon your youthful joy a whole bunch of shoulds and should nots, which more or less probably truncated your experience somewhat of creative joy. So a kind of innocence. And by the way, although I'm describing it in terms of childhood, like you can certainly reawaken that and in your adult life and live that out. And actually, when you think about it, why shouldn't you do that? Why shouldn't you actually hope and strive to reawaken the better parts of your childhood experience? And this might be one of them. You know, when you allow yourself to be playful enough and not constrained by the preordained shoulds and should nots of life, and instead just sort of wander in a state of amazement and childlike wonder in the heat of the creative moment, that it's more about that than it is doing what you should do or avoiding what you should not do. Excuse me. So number 4, a kind of narrowing of consciousness, a lessening of the awareness of other people and their demands. And hopefully you're hearing this as similar to what we just got done saying about childlike wonder and radical amazement. That narrowing your consciousness down to what is unfolding in the moment and not being so much preordained and by what other people would say about what you're doing. So instead of being, what would the word be? Sort of meted out, I guess. That's not the phrase I'm looking for, but maybe it's good enough. By other people's demands and what they think you should be doing and whether you're good enough and all that kind of stuff. Instead of all that, what's really going on in primary creativeness is you're coming into your authentic self. Okay, you're coming into the deep sense of yourself. So there's a different sense of yourself when you're deep in the heat of the creative moment. And at this point, it might be salutary for you to wonder a little bit about who you really are. Okay, because what's being suggested here, and what will be brought out even more as we go further down into this list, is a kind of questioning of who it is you might actually be. Because your normal sense of self, and probably most of us, when we think of the self, we think of it in terms of sort of almost like our resume, in a sense, like a sort of list of factual attributes, and here where I was born, I went to high school, and then this happened, then the other thing happened, and here are my credentials I would have to present to you. Well, you know, that sense of self is exactly what dissolves away in the heat of the creative moment. Okay, so that sense of self is somewhere else, and instead there's a kind of version of the self, although here the word self is almost starting to break down, that is more about simply flowing and pouring forth into the infinite horizon of the present moment. Okay, so a kind of self, if that's the right word, we can even wonder whether that's the right word at this point. So coming into one's authentic self, the self of flow, the self of full immersion in the present moment, and not so much the inauthentic self, which is the self that we tend to present to other people so that we can be liked by them and accepted by them, and also the kind of self that we present to ourselves so we can be liked by ourselves and feel like we're all right human beings. Like all of that is starting to dissolve away in the heat of the creative moment. So number 5, big shock. So I told you these were going to clump together. So here's another one that clumps together with that. A loss of ego. Okay, your normal egoistic awareness. A kind of self-forgetfulness, like you're sort of forgetting about your damn resume and your credentials and what you're trying to do and whether it's going to be acceptable to you or anyone else. Instead, all there is the flow of the engagement of the moment. And I hear a helicopter beginning to chop away outside, so maybe that's the universe's way of punctuating this, you know? So you're carried away, as it were, by the helicopter of primary creativeness in the moment. So a loss of your normal self-consciousness, and most of us, you know, when we feel like we're maybe being creative, have some element of self-consciousness about it. Like, are we doing well enough? Are we Is this good enough? Is this acceptable somehow? And yeah, that's exactly what goes away in primary creativeness. And in its place is, okay, one way of describing it is a total absorption in non-self. You know, in Buddhist language or Sanskrit language, one way of talking about this is an-atman. All right, so if you're sort of keen on Sanskrit, and I know some of you students spend a lot of time studying Sanskrit in your spare time. So an-atman means, well, Atman isn't exactly like the self or the soul. It's a little hard. It's sort of like that, let's put it that way. Total absorption in your non-self, your an-atman. Okay, and like I was trying to suggest to you earlier, it's one of the paths to finding your true identity. So here again is the question, who are you really? Because maybe who you really are is better revealed in your moments of total absorption in the present rather than the normal sense we have of a sort of resume or, you know, a sort of list of facts or factoids about who we think we are. Okay, so a kind of, what else about primary creativeness? Let's keep going down the list. Number 6, inhibiting the force of consciousness. Okay, I think that this is a rather infelicitous turn of phrase on the part of Maslow. I think what he's trying to get at here is an inhibition of the force of self-consciousness, like when you feel self-conscious, that sort of thing, that goes away. Although he says, well, you know, a certain amount of self-awareness is necessary for the secondary creativeness phase of things. You know, you have to be somewhat self-aware and all of that. So those more or less cluster together. The last, 4 of those descriptors cluster together. And the next 3 maybe cluster together in another cluster too. So number 7, your normal fears disappear. And okay, you can kind of see that already adumbrated a little bit in one of the earlier descriptors when we were talking about, well, you're no longer quite so preoccupied with what you should or should not do. Well, a little later down the list, we find that your normal fears disappear. Perhaps your fear of self-consciousness or something like that. Whatever your self-consciousness is about, that goes away. So your fears disappear. Number 8, we find a correlative lessening of your normal defenses and inhibitions. Well, here's the thing about that. Well, maybe if your fears are disappearing, you feel less need to be defended. Less need to sort of, you know, to gird your loins and keep your guard up in these moments of primary creativeness. Like when you're flowing, when you're just flowing in the endless ocean of existence, there's less need to be defended, you know, because you've learned to swim. You've learned to swim in those vast and inexorable tides that are life itself. So number 9, in that same vein, a rising up of strength and courage. Okay, so in primary creativeness, like your strength, like what you have, your power as a human being whose human birthright is to create, to bring invention into the world, to bring the new into the universe. Your strength at the most fundamental level, if you want to think of it that way, starts to rise up. And also, along with your strength, a kind of courage, a quality of heart. Actually, we get that word courage from the Latin cor cordis, which is the word for heart in Latin. That's where we get it. So a kind of quality of your heart. In Spanish, we have the word corazón, right, which has the same root. Okay, so creativity, it turns out, requires courage. Dramatic pause, except for the lawnmower in the background. Creativity requires courage. And in fact, Rollo May wrote an entire book. It's a very good book, I would say, called The Courage to Create. And that title already suggests to you that, well, you know, yeah, creativity requires courage. Well, why does creativity require courage if it's the thing that you're working on as a young elementary school student? Well, maybe it's not quite so obvious in that scenario, but it actually takes courage to be rid of your small, recipe-driven self, your normal sense of who you think you are, to let that dissolve in this vast, teeming ocean of human existence actually does require a certain amount of courage. And the reason why is because most of us cling to our normal sense of self pretty tightly with a white knuckle death grip, as though if we were to let go of that, like we wouldn't survive or the universe wouldn't sustain us somehow. So it takes courage to let go of the smaller sense of self to which we cling in favor of being expansive, in favor of learning to swim, as I said before, in the ocean of life itself. It takes courage to be attracted to mystery. To be creative means that you're bringing something into birth that wasn't there before. So you don't really know necessarily ahead of time what it is you're creating. You know, there's a certain unpredictability to creative process. And so you can't be too freaked out by things like not knowing or uncertainty or mystery or something like that. Like if you're totally consumed by your control project, it's probably going to be very difficult for you to be creative, at least in any genuine sense, because if all you're doing is sort of instantiating your particular control pathology, well, guess what? Probably what is new and what is spontaneous and what is unpredictable and what hasn't been there before is not going to be birthed by that. So to be attracted to and seduced by mystery, by unknowing, by what isn't here but what could be, to be in a kind of dance with possibility, right? Not necessarily with what is already here, which would be actuality, but to be in a kind of mad, delirious dervish dance with what is possible and perhaps even with what is impossible, because where do we get the idea that something is possible if not by way of first thinking that it's impossible? It's a little bit like heavier than air flight was conclusively proven to be impossible right before it happened. Makes you wonder about the category of impossibility. At any rate, so number 7, let's recap for a second. Fears disappear, a lessening of defenses and inhibition, instead a rising up of our true strength and courage, and ultimately the capacity to be attracted to unknowing. So, and at this point I might say to you students, I hope you're learning really deep and profound lessons in unknowing. Even as you know the world better by way of education, I hope that you're also learning to unknow the world better. In other words, to drink in the mysteriousness of all things, even as you learn how all things are subject to a certain sensibility. Okay, so in case you're wondering about my hope for you as students, that would be one way of saying it. I mean, you know, what does your education mean if you're not coming into the depth of life? Like, seriously, all right? A little bit like we were saying in the last video. Okay, so number 10, acceptance. Wow, this sounds like something we were talking about when we were talking about Carl Rogers. Yeah, similar idea. Okay, so acceptance, coming into a positive attitude. So here's a quote from Maslow about this. So primary creative people, or people who know what primary creativeness is about, are apt to become more positive and less negative. It means giving up criticism. Okay, so giving up the critic's posture. See, creative people aren't so much into being critics. They aren't so much into being observers of life. They're into being life. It's not about observing life. It's not about being a like thumbs up or thumbs down, like I liked your status kind of, you know, observing, spectating type posture toward life. It's about, man, it's about inhabiting the moments of your life and not being the critic of someone else's efforts. All right, so giving up criticism, instead cultivating a kind of receptivity, ultimately to life. Okay, so this number 10 and the next couple are also going to clump together. Makes it real easy to sort of get a handle on this stuff. So number 11, trusting. So primary creativeness is more about trusting and less about trying, controlling, and striving. And here the trick is like, see, if you're trying to do something, that means you haven't done it yet. You getting it? Like if you're trying to do something, that means you're not doing it yet. You're trying to do it, that means you're not doing it. You getting it? So instead, primary creativeness is about trusting. Trusting in what? Trusting in the version of you, the version of yourself that is like a non-self, the version of yourself that is beyond who you think you are. So trusting in yourself in a real deep sense, trusting in the world, that the world will sustain you, even if your creative effort, suppose your creative effort is a flop. You know, supposedly Thomas Edison, whom I was quoting earlier, had to try over 1,000 different filaments before he found the one that would actually work in an electrical light bulb. You know, it's like, well, you know, you have to cultivate a very different relation to failure if you're going to be creative, because most creative efforts require tons and tons of failures. Well, you know, if you're too freaked out by the specter that you're failing, you're probably not going to be creative, because you won't have enough courage to sustain yourself through all the failures you have to go through before you finally play the song right, let's say. You know, or you finally invent a light bulb, let's say. Okay, so trusting in yourself, trusting in the world, even in the face of what seem to be failures, enough to give up your control project, because creativity is more than about your damn control project, more than about your damn willfulness and all of that. It's about opening yourself at the deeper layers that aren't necessarily subject to control. The creative muses of antiquity, you can't order them around. You can't control them. They are capricious. They show up when they want and how they want, or not at all. Okay, so you can't control the creative muses. So number 12, maybe it's a little hard to see how you should pronounce that word. It looks like it should be Taoistic, but hardly anyone ever says that. The way they say it is Taoistic, as though there were a D there. So Taoistic receptivity, and this is a reference to Taoism, and in Taoism there's this idea of the way, or the Tao. Okay, so one way of glossing what that might be, although it's somewhat cryptic in the text of Taoism, but let's say a good Western way might be the way to be alive. And if you read like the Tao Te Ching or something like that, it's the principles of non-interference, letting people and things be what they are, letting the moment be what it is, letting the creative moment unfold as it will, rather than trying to control it, rather than trying to force it into one template or something like that, like a Procrustean bed, or, you know, that's well, that's probably an old school reference for some of you, you know. So letting yourself be what you are in the creative moment, having it be okay. It's okay, even if at the end you code your effort as a failure, that's okay. Life will sustain you. You know, you're not as subject to collapse as maybe you think. All right, so 13. Okay, integration of the be cognizer. Ooh, that's not necessarily obvious what that would be. So the question here is, what part of you is creative? And if you're of a neurological persuasion, you might be tempted to do something like a functional MRI scan on people who are in the midst of creative activity to find out what sectors of the brain are associated with creative activity. But Maslow's insight is that actually creativity is an act of your whole person. There's not one part of you that is creative at the expense of all the other parts of you. Creativity is actually an expression of the entirety of what you are. So once again, here's this emphasis on holism. So creativity is an act of the whole person, the entire gestalt, the entire form of or pattern of who and what you are, not split off, not dissociated, not compartmentalized. It's when like all of the different dimensions and sectors of who and what you are come into a kind of convergence in the heat of the moment, might be a way of thinking about it. And that gets us to 14, which sort of like links up with 13. So permission to dip into primary process. Again, that's not necessarily obvious what that would be. So to get this part of it, you have to know that that phrase primary process is actually a phrase from psychoanalytic thinking that refers basically to the workings of the unconscious. So what he's saying with 14 is primary creativeness involves allowing your unconscious to come up and being okay with that, or as okay as you can possibly be with that. So recovery of aspects of the unconscious, the shadow, that's a Jungian way of talking about the unconscious, but it's become very popular, I think, these days. Desire, maybe that's a more Lacanian way of talking about it. The heart, the soul, not just the intellect. So there. Okay, so The camera has gone off once again, reminding me to get on with it and finish off this video because it's starting to get too long. So let's see, where were we? Oh, permission to dip into primary process. Okay, so once again, that's a code phrase for the unconscious. So recovery of the aspects of the unconscious, the parts of you that are repressed, the parts of you that are underneath the surface, the parts of you that are not easily observable from the point of view of your normal conscious awareness and conscious values and all of that stuff. The deeper latitudes of your being, recovering the deeper latitudes of your being, recovering your shadow, your desire, your heart, your soul, not just the illuminative glare of your intellect alone. Okay, so number 15, creative experience is more about aesthetic perceiving rather than abstracting. So that sort of goes along with number 14, which said, well, you know, it's about more than just your intellect. Well, it's about more than just abstracting by way of your intellect too. So aesthetic perceiving, things like savoring, enjoying, appreciating, caring, and seeking, now here's his way of saying it, the greater richness of the percept. Okay, so percept is not necessarily a common word in English. It just means an element of your perception. It's different from precept. So a precept is sort of an idea, an abstract idea. So a percept, let's get the disambiguation thing happening here. So a percept is just an element of your perception. And to try to bring this home to you a little bit, I said it can apply to thinking too, because I wanted to point that out, because thinking is probably one of the main things you're learning in being in college, is how to think in more clever, agile, and accurate ways. So, but actually the deep value of thinking is not merely a pragmatic value. In other words, thinking has value in ways other than the practicality of thinking. The deeper value of thinking might be to open you to the experience of beauty in an ever deeper way, to be able to take in the world by way of understanding it. And the point of taking in the world is to experience it as an aesthetic event, as something beautiful. Okay, that might, you might, in case you've ever wondered what all your damn classes have been about, all the way from kindergarten all the way up to now, well, one way of thinking about them is all of your classes are secret attempts and invitations to open you to the beauty of the universe and the beauty of life itself, so that you can begin to experience your very short and very unpredictable lifespan on planet Earth as an aesthetic event, rather than merely as a kind of pragmatic roboticism or something like that. Like, if you never take in the beauty of the universe, what does your education really matter? Interesting, possibly provocative question for you. At any rate, 16, get on with it. The camera's already turned off once. So full of spontaneity, letting our capacities flow. There's that word again. Csikszentmihalyi, another famous humanistic psychologist with a long, complicated last name, Hungarian, I believe. Letting our capacities flow forth easily. Flow forth. Creativity is about a flowing process, not about a rigidity somehow, without effort, without conscious volition or control. You know, like maybe in your better moments you pour out across the landscape of the world. You know, you pour out like a river or a tide flowing across the shore of life itself. Just a thought. Might alter your fundamental life paradigm if you take that one in. Number 17, fullest expression of the uniqueness of the moment. So primary creativeness is about an honest and direct expression of your own unique person, living in a unique moment of time, hopefully flowing spontaneously within that moment. And finally, number 18, my goodness, you couldn't predict this was coming at this point in the semester. Fusion of the person with the world. Okay, so once again, ringing that bell of holism for whatever, the 1000th time this semester. Feeling oneself in intimate, so a kind of loving closeness, connection with the world, with the universe, with life. And okay, so 18 descriptors. I think that last one is not a bad note to end on. So the real meaning of your creative experience in life, the thing they were trying to teach you in art class in elementary school, might at some level be to feel a kind of intimate, loving, beautiful connection with all that is and all that is life. Okay, well, I guess that's a good note to end on. So have a great day. I hope you're enjoying your quarantine as much as possible. Hey, great time for you to practice a little bit of creativity every now and then. How about that? So take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.